the American criminal justice system, identity politics, and Patrick Pursley, an Illinois man who spent 25 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Today on the Jim Hagerty Show. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're jumping right in. Today we have a special guest who I'm going to try to convince to be a regular panelist or co-host the show here if he'll have me. He's a busy guy these days. He's running a couple of nonprofit organizations, a for-profit business, and he's making up for a lot of time lost in the penal system here in Illinois. Patrick Pursley is with us today. He's a gentleman who spent 25 years in prison for a murder that he did not commit. He knew he didn't commit it the day he was arrested. He knew he didn't commit it every single moment he was in prison in Stateville here just outside of Chicago. And he fought his case about a decade into. It took him about a decade to be acquitted of this. He was tried a second time, and of course, he was actually acquitted based on evidence that he said the entire time he was in prison that was incorrect. He said the gun that was in the case or logged in as evidence was not his. He said it from day one, and that's exactly what was found out at the end of his second trial. So I'll let him talk about it. So Patrick Pursley, welcome. So talk a little bit about this. Your case is one. I just have to say that it's similar to so many cases that we've seen, the Central Park Five. It's very egregious things that have happened to people. And unfortunately, these things are coming up at a time of civil unrest. We see what happened to George Floyd, and we saw what happened to Rayshard Brooks and the gentleman, Jacob Blake, in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And all of these are black men, all unarmed in all three of these cases. So we're seeing policing. I don't know if it's a bad policing at its best, but it's being recorded. And now you come from an era where there wasn't cell phones, but you can relate to some of these tactics that we are now seeing happen sometimes live. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's remarkable what the technology brought to light. First, thanks for having me. I'm honored. You've always been there. You've been right in the case. You've seen it for yourself with my case. As far as to what we're seeing today in today's political climate with social justice issues, for myself, in my opinion, it's just a matter of the technology has made it much easier to catch these actions on tape. I've always felt or kind of believed there was two Americas, and I lived in the margins, in the marginalized America.
And I know I've heard that before. What does that mean to someone? I mean, and I'll just be honest. I'm a white guy. I grew up north of Green Bay, Wisconsin. So you can just imagine how many people of color were up where I came from. I think there were three. There was one African-American family and some Middle Eastern families, but they were assimilated to the culture up there. So I did not grow up around any inner city people of color, and I did not meet any people of that demographic until I went away to college. So what does it mean for someone who a black man to live in those margins? What exactly does that mean to people who may not understand what you mean by that?
I kind of look at it like just two different systems of conduct. The way you're approached and the way you're treated. For a lot of people in the margins, gerrymandering or policing for profit, police brutality, mass incarceration, low education dollars for our schools. This is the norm. This is literally the norm. We are approached and treated just differently, just completely differently. I've had a chance through my case and working on cases while I was in Stateville as a jailhouse lawyer of just basically seeing the two Americas. As you said, General Block took my case as well as Northwestern Center on Wrongful Conviction, and they were able to level the playing field. But the average person who doesn't have resources, they never really get to see the other side of the coin. And it's just that simple, the tale of two Americas.
Yeah, that brings me to some of the cases that we've seen over the years. O.J. Simpson comes to mind. I would have to say that most of us probably would say that O.J. Killed his wife and Ronald Goldman. I would argue that he probably did it. But I would say that had he just been an ordinary man, and some would say an ordinary black man without money, he would have been in prison and without question. I mean, do you agree with that?
Without a doubt. I can even speak a little bit more in depth on that aspect as far as just wrongful convictions. So I'm the guy sitting in Stateville for 2 decades, and you'll see guys working on their cases like myself, and next thing you know, they're on the news, they're getting out of prison. But the people that got out, or the people that get out of prison on the wrongful convictions, if you don't have a lawyer, you're not going nowhere. I have a popular refrain that I used to say: a pro se litigant, pro se gets no play. So the way the system is set up, actually in OJ becomes the exemption of the rule, but he still plays into the rule in the sense of he had money, the affluence, the connections to be able to, some say game the system, beat a murder case. Others say justice was done. I just look at in the sense of to submit the state's case to a rigorous adversarial testing. So if you don't have an attorney or you don't have money to get an attorney, you are basically, you're persona non grata. I asked for the gun testing I received in 2014 is the gun testing that I asked for in the year 2000. The only difference was I now had Jenner and Block, who wound up spending $4.5 million on my legal defense.
How many folks in your case? I mean, you didn't have $4.5 million. Obviously, this is a pro bono situation. But how many of these folks? We saw this in the Making a Murderer case, the Making a Murderer documentary. Stephen Avery, is a lot of his problems right now are kind of centered on the fact that he actually started an appeal without a lawyer. He filed some pro se motions in his case, and they're coming back to haunt him right now because his lawyer is now having to undo that. How often do people with absolutely no legal knowledge whatsoever just attempt to represent themselves in the appellate part of their case? And how many times we've seen it? How many times have you seen it as a jailhouse lawyer, as someone who dug into your case? How many times have you seen that just become the reason these people they remain in prison?
Well, they say if you have yourself as a lawyer, you have a fool for a client. I think
Absolutely.
The law library in Stateville was packed with people filing their own briefs. The entire time I was there, I worked in the law library twice. I was in the law library basically every week that I could be there. Now this goes directly to the education system and lay persons versus professional. So here it is, you have people who are coming from the margins trying to understand law, and you're going from like a post-conviction petition to a federal habeas corpus, and you get this language. You have to show this language. However, you could literally have the Pope as your alibi. If you don't follow the rules and procedures and the complexity of the law, you're not getting out. You're not getting out. You're in procedural default. And I can tell you, as someone who taught law to my fellow inmates, someone who was a jailhouse lawyer, took paralegal classes through the mail. I got a grant while I was in Stateville. I'm so blessed in the sense that I actually got lawyers to help me get out. But I would say a good 80, 90% of the people that are in Stateville that will never get out, guilt or innocence notwithstanding, just, you could have all the evidence in the world, but the complexities of law foreclude them from being able to follow these procedures. Then of course you got lockdowns, can't get copies at the library. So if you're late on a petition, one day in federal court, you're gun smoked. It's over with. Bill Clinton had passed the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act. And that right there just locked so many people in to prison, period.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw that be a problem in the case of Brendan Dassey. Now, you're familiar with the lawyers there. Stephen Drizzen was. Did he represent you at first during your
actually
early?
Took my case.
Okay.
Both him and Jenner, or Northwestern, where he's from, Center on Wrongful Convictions, and Jenner took my case, but they had told me no 3 times.
Okay.
So he told me my persistence got them to actually take notice of my case.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Your case was, I found it quite ironic and quite, I would say, liberating. I'm sure you feel this way as well. The entire time you're in prison, you knew the gun that was logged into evidence, the murder weapon, was not your gun. It was the wrong gun. The state claimed you used to kill this guy. You knew it wasn't the gun, and that's exactly what the judge said at the end of this 10 or 12 year 25 year ordeal. How did you feel knowing that what you have been saying the entire time? I mean, not only did you say, "Hey, I didn't get a fair trial," you said, "Listen, I didn't do this."
I'm going to tell you, I was just as body numb as I was when I walked out the courtroom as I was when I got found guilty.
Okay.
One of the greatest blessings of my case, and Judge McGraw had seen this clearly, and he started on the facts of the case and went down the line of how all the evidence, all the physical evidence, all the evidence is contradicted. So a lot of people, coming from the margins, such as myself, prior records, all this, we have what you call a credibility deficit. Right. It's like, how do you know he's lying? He's talking. So that's how the court kind of viewed me for the longest time. However, with McGraw, he went through the evidence. I'm talking direction, clothing, everything, footprints, everything in my case contradicted. So I feel very blessed, because if any circumstances had been any different, I might still actually be sitting in prison. I think the greatest feat of my case was actually writing an article that became a state law, and that's how I get the gun testing. So it's like to sit here on this side of things and think back on that, and to see how the things I filed then when I was by myself pro se still, it went to the heart of the matter. It's still being used in proceedings right now today. So it's very surreal. It's very surreal. That's about the best way I can put it.
You sat in prison 25 years knowing you didn't do this, and then you had to sit through a second trial, knowing that you could be sent right back there. Was it difficult for you to sit there knowing that you could go right back? I know you're out on bond for about a year, right?
Yeah, I was out on bond. And just the thought, knowing that if I was found guilty, I wasn't going home. Right. And the best way I can explain it, it's like I was sitting on a chair that was on a cliff that overlooked hell. And if I was found guilty again in that moment, the chair would just, me and the chair just tumble right down back into the pit. That was the best way I could sum it up. I was literally sitting on the edge of the abyss, and I did not know if I was going home again or not.
Well, yeah. And of course, you walked out of the courtroom. I was there that day. A lot of people were there to support you. I mean, did you know that the crowd would be outside in the lobby when you walked out? I mean, there were fellow exonerees, some local guys here. That one guy was your roommate, your cellmate, John Horton, who was wrongfully convicted. Another guy, Alan Beeman, wrongfully convicted for killing his girlfriend, and I believe a couple of years before your case hit. So there was just this community of support that you were met with when you walked out. Did that surprise you at all?
Not in the sense of the crescendo had been building, right? So everyone wanted to see, not just supporters, but just everyone wanted to see how it was going to turn out. Myself, I think I told you, I was just as body numb as when I was found guilty. So I really don't even remember walking out of the courtroom. Like I look at a newspaper clipping and someone had hugged me and I don't even remember who this person was. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't remember when it happened. So it's such an out of body experience. That's the best way I can explain it.
Wow.
And it was good to know the support was there. Obviously, that's a great thing. Community support is key in addressing these issues, these social ills.
When you first contacted me, you were willing, you were eager to get this story out into the press. And as a reporter, I found this, it was unusual because I've covered these types of things before, and usually defense lawyers and defendants are simply not, or they're instructed not to get things too far in the weeds as far as the public goes, and which kind of translates, don't talk to the media. But you wanted to get this message out. You had been, I believe, accused of violating your bond at one point because someone caught you at a bar or having a beer at a restaurant or something like that. So there were just things that were happening to you during this time between while you were awaiting your second trial, and you wanted to get that out in the public, and you wanted to talk to the media. I mean, how important was that? Because we covered a lot of things that I as a reporter normally would not have been able to cover because the information wouldn't have been given to me. It was a very unusual thing that you wanted to talk to the press, and I believe the public got to know some things that they wouldn't have if this would have been in another circumstance.
So, what a lot of people don't realize was that, they were seeing the outside the case, seeing me get in trouble on pretrial, right? A lot, but I had an equal interest in building my organization. I think on pretrial, we did an event at the Coronado Theater, Kid Culture. We gave away $1,750. So I had been building kid culture while I was in prison back in mid 2000s, and had the help of professors and teachers, volunteers that got our material out. So I always had a vested interest in kind of like using my case as a means to get the attention, but build the organization in real time. What I didn't anticipate was that I would have such a hard time on pretrial. I did not expect to be halfway free. There was no, so that whole second trial and that whole period of time was very rough. But I also knew that if I could get people aware of my case, right? I love with Martin Luther King, it's like you shed light on a situation to showing injustice. He wasn't the first person to come up with that tactic. So it didn't matter how much the system was pummeling me at that time on pretrial. What mattered to me was to be able to expose in the light of day, because Rockford is very isolated. And for the most part, the media is very soft on Rockford officials. They butter their bread. They give you guys access to the court. So I knew that I had to scream it from the hilltops. And I was very blessed. We got it into Associated Press through Ivan Marino, who, my story literally went around the world twice, and that in itself is just one of those things you can't quantify it.
Right. So for those who may just be kind of tuning in to who you are and your case, now this case or this homicide happened in 1993, correct, in Rockford, Illinois, yes, where we are right now, just outside of Chicago, in the state of Illinois, the free state of Illinois, land of Lincoln, Abe, that is. So this killing happens in 1993. Kind of take us back to the, I guess, to that day, really. I saw the state present its case, the version of what happened. And that is that they claim that the victim drove to this apartment complex. This was the allegations. You approached them with a gun. You attempted to rob them. Someone in the car was a couple. Mr. Andy Asher was the victim, he and his girlfriend. They said, we don't have any money. And so it was a robbery gone wrong. You allegedly shot this guy and ran off into the distance or into the night. Take us back to that.
A couple months before my arrest, this guy gets murdered. It's a tragedy. I didn't even know of it until everything, come crashing down on me a couple months later. So it was just as much as a surprise to me as it was to everyone else. The biggest thing, I believe, just being a repeat offender, recidivist, right, in and out of prison, I really believe that it puts people that are already in the margins of the margins, and you become almost like a disposable person. So when they made the decision to give me that crime, it's amazing because so much evidence was ignored that showed that I didn't do it. And
now, were you approached but by police? Did they bring you in for questioning? And what was the process there? Because I know they searched your house or your girlfriend's home. They found these guns, which were legally owned, by the
way. They got my girlfriend at the time. She had made statements. She tried to take statements back. It was too late. So by the time they got me, she was pregnant and questioned for like 12 hours. None of that stuff matters to the system. Once the wheels get set in against you, a lot of times it just keeps on rolling, and it takes literally, the average wrongful conviction takes 25 years to come to light. The average wrongful conviction, so it took a long, long time to be able to really get them to look at the evidence.
Right, and the state stuck with the same version of what they believe happened.
Still is to this day.
Okay.
Still is.
And of course, you weren't anywhere near the scene. Now,
I was with my son playing with the chemistry set. His birthday was that just a few days before it came from Wisconsin. Those things, what they call that, back to the credibility deficit, right? So if you have an alibi where if you don't have some type of tangible proof on video or some, back then, I guess if you punch into work and 15 people see you, disinterested witnesses. But when you have people that are family, they are considered biased automatically. They are automatically almost discounted.
At one point, did this story that your girlfriend told police and then retracted, or allegedly told police? Did she tell the police that she was driving you around the city that day looking for people to rob, and you got out of the car, went and committed this crime, and then returned and instructed her to leave and told her something like, if you go to the police, I'll kill you, or something like this? What was the nature of that? Where did that originate? Because they attempted to use that. Your ex-girlfriend was charged with perjury at one point, and I've seen this type of thing before. Talk about that a little bit and how that kind of played into everything.
Well, what I learned while I was doing my jailhouse lawyery, right, jailhouse litigator, is that a very familiar tactic of detectives is to tighten the screws on the women that are attached to defendants. And basically, if you are, threatened with the loss of your children or never been in trouble before, you question hours and hours and hours, you're also pregnant. There's, people make false confessions, so this is something that I've seen time and time again, even in Rockford cases where, just they get a woman, get her alone in that interrogation room, and they walk out with what they want, so it's just another unfortunate circumstance
Now you mentioned being in the margins, marginalized people, and now we've seen this. And the idea in policing, and I believe this goes back to some of the tactics used in very prominent police departments in the 80s and 90s. Now we're seeing, speaking of that time period, a lot of cases that are coming back now on appeal. A lot of exonerations are happening, and a lot of these cases happened in that late 80s, early 90s timeframe, where technology is now advanced, and we are seeing that a lot of defendants were right. They weren't the people who committed these crimes. But it goes back to policing in that era, and in cities where gangs were running neighborhoods, Los Angeles, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, some of these crime-ridden areas that were just gang infested at the time, which was true. The idea that the policing was behind basically the idea that getting these gangsters or gangbangers, and gangbangers, what I grew up hearing that term used by police officers. It was used in the media very prevalently. And so getting gangbangers, so to speak, off the streets at all costs was very prominent in policing in those days. And even if they had to frame someone, the idea was at least we got one of these gangbangers off the street. And you're a guy who had some prior cases. You'd been to prison once or twice before this occurred.
Three times.
So how important is it for people to understand that that narrative was prevalent in that idea in policing, that as long as you get these quote unquote bad guys, these quote unquote gangbangers off the street, it's a service to the community?
Well, this is where, if I could just go back to the racism thing, you can have overt racism where someone's in your face calling you the N-word, or you can have laws and policies that are set up that affects communities, largely communities of color, poor communities, Hispanic, poor whites, blacks. So when you have these narratives that's these people on the bottom that's doing this rampant crime, right? The narrative isn't how we can provide jobs and education to these people, right? The narrative is, at least it was, especially in the mid 90s, early 90s, was lock them up, throw away the key. 96 was big on that. Clinton was big on that. A lot of major bills were passed between 90 and 96 that led to what we have, what's coined now as mass incarceration, which predominantly affects people of color. So this idea, this is a form of racism in the sense of institutional racism. You see, so institutional racism is so much different than, Billy Bob down there with his shaved head and his Nazi regalia at counter protesting Black Lives Matters, right? So institutional racism is very much more nuanced. While I was locked up, I read a book called The Art of War, Sun Tzu. And it says, a soldier on the field can kill a man with one arrow. He can kill one man. However, someone who writes laws can kill an entire generation with the stroke of a pen. So it's very hard for people really, especially people who don't live this life, who don't come from these margins, who are affected by, like I said, gerrymandering, poor schools, heavy police tactics, right? The list goes on and on. But if you're not living it, it's very hard to see it, call it for what it is. So I just find like it's just part of the apparatus or part of doing business. And like I said, I've been to prison 3 times. There's no justifying my dumb stuff. But if you look at the cases, like being sent to prison for less than a half ounce of weed for 2 years in maximum security prison, when you look at how the punishment is meted out on this side of the table, is so disproportionate. But once again, especially like if we talk today where, everyone's just trying to stay alive because of COVID. And then a lot of people see the Black Lives Matters or the, like you said, George, all these killings of unarmed Black people on TV. However, what I submit to you is that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg it's been there, you know, and a lot of people find it hard to deal with or even fathom that your whole life can be impacted by the pen, by laws that keep you in a disadvantaged area, or, you know, basic things like redlining, you know, just basic things that me and you may know about. But if you're born and raised into this, and these environments have a poverty level as well as a gang and drug component. So now these kids ain't trying to understand, you know, marginalized thinking and the politics of, you know, racism, or they just want to survive, have food, have a car, have the same things, but they speak a different language, right? They speak the language of the streets. So it's very hard. It's very hard for people to have sympathy for some kid that's gang banging, catching mob actions, selling drugs. It's hard. You know, you would have more sympathy for animal in a PETA commercial, you know, or endangered species, a shark, you know, a great white.
That brings up several questions that I've always had. I mean, we can't ignore, and I don't know if some of the population, maybe the affluent population or the white population, wants to ignore that these things are happening. I mean, I when the argument comes up or the conversations come up, I tend to point to cases like yours, the Central Park Five, where egregious things were done to these people, you being one of them. And it comes down to Black men who were either unarmed or were never around the scene. And we're just at the mercy of police officers who were very skilled interrogators. And they were interrogating someone who there's certainly no lawyers present, and certainly the people who didn't know or have the wherewithal legal training to understand that they didn't have to talk to the cops. But then again, people are being brought in and interrogated and coerced and beaten in some cases. So you see these things, and it brings me to the question: are these things happening because we have policies in place? I mean, let's just be real. The civil rights movement made things like redlining illegal. It made things like discriminating against someone because of his or her skin color illegal. These things are illegal to do. It's illegal to discriminate against people. But yet we see these things happening over and over again. So is it a question of systematic racism or institutional racism that's being sparked by racist people who just shouldn't be in those positions? That's what I wrestle with.
Well, I kind of look at it like this, like power, you know, knows no boundaries. So if you have a social narrative that says, hey, those are the bad guys, and your every movie sanctions, by all means necessary, take the bad guy down. Now, that's just the narrative. What people don't understand is that the Constitution, as we know, the Bill of Rights and, you know, 14th Amendment, all those things, for a lot of police that are caught up fabricating cases, right?
And make no mistake, that has happened, and it's happening today. I wanted to add that.
Even as a way to support myself in prison, I worked on cases. Even the most guilty of parties, the police would, you know, the Constitution didn't mean anything, rules and regulations didn't mean anything, right? So
we're taught that
the rules and regulations go out the window.
Right. And we're taught that if you're a felon, you lose all these rights. And And you can voting, you can't own a firearm. What I mean, if you're a felon, you're a marked person in this country. And in certain circumstances, there are certain felons that I don't want to have guns. Let's just be real. But the idea is, in the media when I was growing up, yes, catch the bad guy at all costs. And there were certain other narratives as well, as that the bad guy is usually a black guy in a lot of movies, right? And so they become felons. And now there's an even bigger mark on these marginalized populations because of the way things are depicted. And I mean, I'll just tell you, I think I've said this to you. I grew up when I went to college in the early 90s. One of the things that I just was just basking in was all of this culture that I was suddenly just inundated with. There was black people, there was Asian people, international students, all just at my disposal, and it was beautiful. I couldn't believe that I was in the midst of all this culture that I had missed all my life, just because the simple fact that I didn't grow up in a city. But it was different than what I had seen all my life in the media. This steady diet of false narratives. And it was a very confusing time for me. I mean, as simple as it can be explained is, hey, the black guy down the hall from me is not a gangbanger. Unbelievable, right? And how many people go through these epiphanies, these transformational times in their lives where they just realize, hey, I've been duped.
Well, I think conversely, think about the good kid that's on Avon Street, and he's surrounded with these negative stereotypes. The good kid, who is also poor, may give in to the temptations of adopting the narratives and the definitions of who he's supposed to be in society. So it plays twofold. Right? So you have marginalization, but within marginalization, you have self-criminalization, where you're adopting, like, you know what? F it. That's what it is. That's what it is. And a lot of times that's born of these hard times. That's born of hearing this narrative that you're literally nothing. And if this is what you see, where the violence, right? The violence at your own door, the violence within your own house, all these dysfunctions that are, in impoverished areas, right? So you can't look at the cause because you're too busy looking at the symptom. And that's what society puts forward, is the symptom is the problem instead of the cause. And so what it's really twofold of an injustice. And it's a good thing that you did, get out and kind of learn, well, this is the melting pot, to be around different people and different cultures. College is great for that. But for a lot of people, what don't understand is at the bottom of the melting pot, there's people burnt on like, bad cooking, and they're considered the dregs. The dregs of society, right? And supposed to spoil the rest of the meal for everyone else. And it's really unfortunate on both sides of the coin, not just for the average citizen to believe these false narratives, but for the good kid gone bad and doing the shooting on the west side of Rockford or south side of Chicago, or wherever, because someone has put in his head that he is nothing, so much so that he views the rest of us as nothing. And it's very sad. It is.
Do you believe that that reality is the product of a systematically racist system, or is it more of or is it something else?
Well, that question, it really is a hard question, because I'm a student of history. So a student of history shows me that this has been the par for the course. It just had different names, whether it was slavery, New Construction era, Jim Crow, right? it transforms in name, but it doesn't, but the effect remains the same. And so, you know, I look at institutionalized racism and institutions of today, right? These businesses and corporations that's been around all this time and have not yet set the playing field right within their own doors. So, you know, it could be, you know, hey, if I give it the benefit of doubt, we'll call it just gross deliberate indifference. Sure. But I kind of feel this is the way things have been generational after generation. And, you know, it is what it is.
How many more cases like George Floyd or Rayshard Brooks or Jacob Blake, and the one here in Rockford, now that wasn't recorded. The gentleman who was shot 3 times, twice in the back, he's still recovering. He's been in a coma. But you see these cases, and George Floyd was a horrific thing to watch. But I just have to be honest, I was more disturbed about what happened. I was more disturbed by the video of the shooting of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta and the shooting of the fatal shooting in Atlanta and the near fatal shooting in Kenosha of Mr. Blake. And I was more disturbed about those 2 videos because it showed me that we have police officers on the streets. We perhaps we have police officers on the streets of the United States who maybe shouldn't be cops. And you've seen both of these videos. I believe we talked about this.
Yes.
The Rayshard Brooks, he was a drunk driver blocking a Wendy's drive-through. The employee called the police. Police get there. They get in a struggle with him. And mind you, he's just a drunk driver. A crime, but albeit he wasn't a violent guy. I believe there was some chit-chat there. He was slurring his words, obviously drunk. And had some words, and then of course he struggles with the police. He overpowers these 2 officers and runs away with a taser and points the taser. And of course, the first thing this officer does was shoot him. My question there is, what have been wrong with allowing this guy, Rayshard Brooks, obviously drunk guy, run into the darkness and fall down, pass out under a tree, and he was on foot, by the way, and just arrest him later? What would have been wrong with that? The only thing I see is 2 police officers who were overpowered by this guy. Perhaps they were embarrassed by that. So the first course of action was to shoot this guy in the back. Now, fast forward to the Jacob Blake situation. He's wrestling with cops in earlier video. And then, of course, a taser didn't work on him. Long story short, he escapes the clutches of the police. They allow him to casually walk around the side of his car while the cops have guns pointed at him. And of course, they attempt, a feeble attempt, in my opinion, to grab his T-shirt. And when he gets into the car, they just fire 7 shots. My question is, I posed this question to people, and I get mixed reviews, mixed answers. What it have turned out differently? Either A, there were some cops there who were a little more skilled in hand-to-hand combat or wrestling. Perhaps these guys would have been a little more physically fit than these other guys. Would they have been able to take this guy down without shooting him? And if that's the case, and these 2 gentlemen, these two cops, were not as skilled as perhaps someone else might be. My question is, should they be police officers in the first place? You can't take down this 150-pound guy. I mean, Jacob Blake is not this big guy. He wasn't using advanced karate moves on these police officers, and they allowed him to casually walk into his car and retrieve what was told was a knife. He had already, well, as far as I saw, wrestled with the police, which is a crime. He was wanted on some warrants. He wasn't complying. Okay, so here's a guy who should have been restrained. Why did he deserve 7 shots in the back? That's my frustration with all this. Now in Rockford, we got a guy in a high-speed chase. Of course, that's a crime, alleged crime. Crashes a vehicle, gets out. The police officer thinks he has a gun and shoots 9 times or 5 times, 6 times, and hits the guy twice in the back. Later on, well, there's no gun found at the scene. When is this going to stop? And when are we going to get police officers? Now, we give cops in this country guns, and we allow them to take these guns against citizens if need be. And let's just be real. Cops are taught you do not pull out your gun unless you intend to use it. And if you shoot your service weapon, you shoot to kill. Let's just be real. So if that is going to be the first thing police officers resort to, instead of learning tactics where you make arrests, then I would, to be honest with you, if that's the kind of police officers we are going to hire, I don't want cops on the street. And I'm kind of a law and order guy. I want to be able to call the police. But are we getting to the point in this country, and maybe you can tell me as a black man, are we getting to the point in this country where people don't want to call the cops? Because if I'm a victim, I call the cop, maybe I'll get arrested. I mean, how real is that fear in some communities in this country? And what are we going to do to stop this?
Well, first of all, once again, we go back to the narratives. So the narratives a lot of time breed people who become police officers, not all, but some, for the wrong reasons. If we look at history, you always had the Rough Riders, right? You always had these people who wanted to put down the savages, right? But then on the flip side of the overly gun-ho cop, there's the officer who also was fed the narratives, and he has he's over fearful. So those are two types of personality types that a lot of times I believe have led to these circumstances. Now, if we go back to when we talk about the Tale of Two Americas, how often growing up or within the white experience do you see where the officer brings home the guy who's drunk, right?
Oh, I was one of those guys on 3 occasions.
I know firsthand. I've seen people literally drunk drive, crash car, not get breathalyzer tests simply because they were white. So it really is about the narrative and about what people feel. So the question is, how do you weed out these people who have internalized this toxic narrative that all of us are super dangerous, super felons, super criminals, and must be put down at all costs, regardless if it's drunk driving or getting in a scuffle with the police, right? That is a very real question. As a nation, how do we weed that out? Because there was always a certain glory within those guys, like the cowboys and Indian movies. I relate to that because it's very much the same today, right? So the guy who goes out there and he's fighting the Indians and we're going to put him down, remember the Alamo, and you have these different narratives and they're just overly gun-ho. You see that in theaters of operations, wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, where these atrocities happen all the time. So you want to be able to, pose the question, how do we weed this out? Or how do you weed out the guy who becomes an officer and he was picked on as a young guy? So now he's empowered with the gun and the badge. He's not there to help community. He's there to basically, whatever comes his way, he's going to deal with it most likely in the most harsher tone. And of course, this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough. And it's so common that it is part of a systemic wrong, and it's intergenerational. And that's the hardest part, because you're rolling this into a new generation after generation, and the momentum is so strong. And these narratives that create prejudice in people's minds is so strong. It's very hard to really, from a human aspect, psychology, sociology, how do you weed that out?
Yeah, but again, to me, how many times are we gonna have to see this before before people who maybe in my camp or people who are just staunch back the blue, which I'm not. I'm not in that camp at all. I'm a law, like I said, I'm a law and order guy. I want to be able to call the police, and I want the police to, if I need them, to come to my aid and take these disputes and figure them out. Whether somebody gets arrested, do policing the way policing is supposed to be done. If that's what if policing is becoming shooting and ask questions later, no one's going to be safe. I can sympathize with some of the abolitionists who have that idea and have that goal.
Well, it's very hard for me to speak to those terms, right? I could never say abolish police because we need law and order. However, what I will tell you is that in every person of color that I know has an inherent fear of the police. There's if the police get behind you or they show up at your door, right? There's this just a deep-seated fear of the police. So even as I sit here on this side of a wrongful conviction, I fear when I'm driving or when I'm in my house, that the police can come in and do anything to me at any time. And that is a real shame because this is so prevalent. So like in those instances where children are growing up seeing these heavy-handed tactics being used on their fathers, their uncles, their mothers. You call the police because your son is drunk or he has mental health issues, and next thing you know, he's face down in the mud. Children are seeing this. So in the interest of the futures of America, I'm hoping that there's a real look at how do we solve this. There's a real look, and that's how I like to go at problems. I don't want to go at it from a knee-jerk reaction because that's a reactionary. There has to be a proactive look at this. But one of the hardest things to do, especially like in a conservative area like Rockford, right? How do you get the average citizen to be able to understand that this is a systemic wrong? You shouldn't build a police station that's as big as the projects. You should be able to provide economic and careers, jobs, education dollars, for these people if you want them to be a part of your society from a real perspective,
And I would say, speaking of projects, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on that, but the public housing is obviously a huge problem, and it's been something that needs to be addressed, and it just simply never gets addressed. Projects public housing are still taking swaths of cities, of people, and the people have the same socioeconomic problems, and they're stacking them on top of each other in these huge projects. And then the same leaders sit and scratch their head saying, why is there crime in these areas? Anybody with an ounce of common sense can see that this is the very system of public housing is playing into some of the criminal behavior that's going on. So I guess that brings me to this question. What would you say to the belief, because I hear it all the time, yes, black men are disproportionately arrested, but it's because they are disproportionately committing crimes. What do you say to that, I say, somewhat trite narrative?
Well, that's a very common narrative. That's a very common narrative. I would tell the average person, if you had to eat served sandwiches or was homeless, if you were hungry as a child, if you lived in these places where it's devoid of hope, then run that narrative past me again. I can't even tell you how many cases being locked up where I would get like young guys that had murder cases as cellies in Stateville, right? And one of the most common story when I talk to them about why did they get into the gang, why did they get into crime, I said, man, I needed to eat, I needed clothes, right? America is still very much a land of materialism, aspirational lifestyle, right? So that's one level, but there's a basic level where, and I myself, I went through this. There's a basic level of where you are just hungry or homeless, or you might as well be homeless. You're just in a bad neighborhood. And you're like, man, I gotta hustle, I gotta eat. And this is what you see as a way out. So a lot of people, they don't see the opportunities. And I can tell you there's a huge difference between the average white kid and the average black kid. The average white kid that I met in prison, out of prison, their fathers, they were taught a skill. The average black kid, his skill is derived of hustling, selling drugs, rap, whatever the case, these negative narratives. But they don't really know how to do much else. So yes, it's very easy to say, well, if you didn't do the crime, we wouldn't be here now.
Right.
But I always look at, there's a bigger crime at play when tax dollars are used in an inequitable fashion that keeps you secure and keeps me barren. See, I believe Rockford had won a huge lawsuit about the disparity of tax dollars that go into the schools for impoverished people. And this really, they say, who's the bigger criminal, the one in the ghetto or the one who makes the ghetto? And so there's a social responsibility for, yes, Tyrone at the low end of the spectrum, but there's a bigger social responsibility for those who know and kind of like they're complicit. They just kind of go along with it and use the narratives as a justification for what is happening to Tyrone and Tanisha. See, but if it was their children going through it, or when their children go through it, it's a different narrative. It's a known joke. They say when a black person commits a crime, the people from his community, oh, I know he was bad, right? But when a white kid gets in trouble, before that kid is even in the handcuffs, he's got mental health issues. He's got this. They're mitigating for him before the handcuffs got warm on his wrist. And so there's almost like this look of just this guy over here, he's worth nothing. He has no redemptive value, and he's already written off prior to being born. And so they kind of like robs us of our own humanity because we ingest this thinking. We become product of this thinking, and then we embrace it. And once it's embraced, see, then that's where the problem really comes in. Because yeah, we consider ourselves, yeah, okay, I'm the little gangster, I'm the little blood, the Crip, the king, whatever the case is. And our rule is the same rule as your rule, right? But with much less civility. Much less civility. So I love this saying. It says, when the leaders are corrupt, so shall be the people. So the kid on the bottom, he sees the news. He hears about our leaders and what they're doing and the wars and all these things. He hears about the corruption. He can't touch that level. But if he can break in your house, he's going to break in your house. If he can sell drugs, because it's about access. So that's really it's a very hard dynamic. It's a very hard dynamic to take apart.
Now, would a better sense of community in some of these situations kind of solve that? Because I learned a long time ago in moving around a little bit. I haven't lived in many different places, but I've seen certain cities that have a better sense of community than other cities. I believe Rockford has stumbled in this area, and that's an idea that you may have a next door neighbor or someone down the street, or another part of the city where there are things happening, crime, drugs. They may be poor minority areas, maybe they're public housing complexes, and the idea that you touched on it is there are populations or sectors of the populations who just believe it's happening over there. It's not my problem. The kid with maybe a gang affiliated father, maybe a drug addicted mother, whatever it may be, that kid is not my problem. My thought is, if we live in a community, no matter what this community is, what would be wrong with understanding that these are, as a community, these are our problems. And I guess to put it another way, do we want somebody to fall through the cracks and end up in this school to prison pipeline, if you will, or the streets to prison pipeline, however you want to phrase it, because his parents made some mistakes? Or is it right to step up and say, this is my problem? Why are we failing in these areas, in your opinion? So someone who's seen both sides of this, coming from that marginalized place in life to someone who went through a long road, and now who's just coming out of the other side of this, and you have a nonprofit organization that addresses these issues. You've written a curriculum that addresses some of these issues. How important is it, and what message are you sending to people who may come to you, children who may come to you, whose parents are not really out of that lifestyle yet?
Well, apathy, the first part is apathy. Pretty much all suffering is proportional to that person. So you might spend a day in jail and that was your worst day. I spent a quarter century in jail, and that suffering, to me, it's greater than yours, but your suffering is as great. We're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So there's all these things that are being stripped away, and people are free falling. Entire communities are being lowered down to lower levels, homelessness, hunger, right? You have people going to be evicted out their houses as soon as the moratorium is over, eviction moratorium, right? So when you live in a country where it's the me first mantra, right? It's a dog eat dog world, it's rat race, all these things, right? So now on the flip side, the people who are trying to have the Black leaders in Rockford, they are not even considered by the system. See, that's one thing. There's no, if we come from the bottom, then automatically, even when we're trying to do right, we're not legitimate or legitimate enough to be able to sit at the table with the policy makers. So basically, you have an apathetic public that is bought into this narrative. You have a system that profits off of people's demise. And then you basically have the child or the teen who was born into this 25, 30 years of gangster music, right? The whole everything, right? And on top of that, you have the resources being bled out of those areas slowly over time. So like the Rockford West Side might be 40 blocks of blight. So what you're talking is a Herculean task, because on one hand, like my job, you mentioned my job is to teach little Tyrone and Tanisha to understand their own intrinsic value, as well as the next person's value. But also that whatever you think you can get out the street, it is not worth you losing your life for or your future for. Now, on the flip side, when I get to talk in these circles, or I'm in Springfield or Notre Dame or wherever, I'm trying to break it down in a way where white America can understand this is your problem, because we're all connected. So you have a tax structure and you're paying this tax money, and more tax money is going to incarcerate people than to educate people. Then there's a fundamental wrong in that. There's a fundamental wrong in that. Or you have a prison system that just holds people and don't educate them and then let them go time and time again without any type of preparation, no resources, no social net, no nothing.
How
this is very complex. This is a very complex problem.
It is. But is it? I guess the question is it rooted in some very simple ideas and some simple facts? And one of those would be to pose a question: how rehabilitative is the United States prison system?
Right now, I'm very proud to be like part of this leading edge to help bring grants and college programs back into Stateville, Illinois prisons, Prison Neighborhood Arts Project. However, that's only a handful of prisons. When you have guys that are just incarcerated, locked in your cell, watching TV, right, going to the yard, but not really having any control over their life, it is very hard to get them to think differently because they're viewed as trash outside and now they're viewed as trash on the inside. So if you take myself, I got out and Rockford had the highest unemployment when I lived in Rockford. So of course, I always worked a job, but working a job didn't pay my bills. So when you're talking about how hard would it be to actually, how rehabilitative are prison systems, I would say on a scale 1 through 10, I would say barely a 2, because recidivism is at such a high degree. It is at such a high degree. Now, people such as myself, done 15, 20, 25 years, it drops down. People kind of age out of it. And I was very blessed to build something. IamKidCulture.org while I was locked up. But I built that knowing full well, who's going to hire me? Who's going to hire I'm 55 years old. Who's going to hire a non-skilled 55-year-old with a prior prison record? So it is very hard. It is very hard because there's, it's like an industry, and the prisoners are chattel and part of a crop, and that crop brings in money. So you have to take the financial incentive out of incarceration before incarceration even starts to become rehabilitation. And then also another thing that's really taught in restorative justice is that this is such a retributive system. It's all about that pound of flesh. That's why it's so easy to put the wrong person on trial for a crime he didn't do, because you're feeding the public their pound of flesh. If you could take the retributive aspect out of it and then bring forth a rehabilitative or restorative attribute to it, you would really change the system overnight. But you have to take the economic incentive just to warehouse people out of the equation.
That's an interesting perspective. IamKidCulture.org is your website. I Am Kid Culture is your nonprofit. Let's talk about that. Now, you wrote a curriculum that you are attempting to teach in schools. You've talked about this in colleges across the country. And talk a little bit about that. What's the central message of I Am Kid Culture? And a little bit of the history. Now, you started this while you were in prison, correct?
Yeah, I started in mid-2000s when I had Natural Life professors, got our stuff out to gang peace circles, high schools, colleges, middle schools. It's just this idea to reduce gun and gang violence, promote higher education and vocation, and to empower these youth, right? So since when I got out on bond in 2017, everyone wanted me to stop. Like, just wait till after your second. I refused to stop, because I built this as a vehicle, as a profession because I was a ward of the state. My first group home was right there on Court Street, Seeds Group Home. You know, I was a ward of the state, went through 15 homes, facilities, and institutions. So one thing, getting locked up at a young age, you have like arrested development. So parts of my personality are very immature and childlike. All I did was take that part of me and look at my inner, right, my inner child, my inner teen, and what would I say to that person? So that person doesn't wind up going to prison repeatedly or losing his life to wrongful conviction. Now, what we do actually with the kids, you know, we teach things like hood PTSD, intergenerational incarceration, you know, but you can't tell a 12-year-old the word intergenerational incarceration straight out. We put it to them like hashtag confessions of a jail dad. You got someone in your family locked up and resonates with them. You kind of see that aha moment. Then when we brought it out to the streets, we would actually create content. So we we're about to come on to the 2-year anniversary of the mixtape, right? Kid Culture Presents Choices. You know, we had 11-year-olds not only doing a song, we don't play about our grades, but there was a skit about gang recruitment because in real life, their uncle had been murdered right there in Fairgrounds, almost right where I was arrested. There's 3 shrines. So we're taking real world lessons and we're trying to connect them with the idea that their life has value, the next person's life has value, and arts, entertainment, and education, as well as career trajectories, all these things work hand in hand to give the teenager, the kid on the west side of Rockford or trapped in someone's ghetto, someone's trap, that they have value, they have a social responsibility unto themselves to save themselves from the gang, right? Because you can't tell a 12-year-old what to do. You can't but if you can get them to understand that their life has value and you will lose your life. And you see people losing their life all the time because of this, then you can plant the seeds for change. And that is basically all we work to do.
You talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. You call it hood PTSD. What is the idea there, and how many of these young people that you help actually suffer from that disorder because of what they see on an everyday basis?
Well, I would put it like this. I would put 7 out of 10 of the kids that I've dealt with. If you live in a neighborhood where you hear shooting 2-3 times a week, there's no opportunities, and the rest of kids fighting, doing whatever, those numbers are high. Hypervigilance is just one of the symptoms. You can imagine, how much you see a kid looking around, always being super aware of his environment, right? Because there's that fear of, being hurt by his own or being hurt by the police. 2 down, 2 flies. So it is very real. And I can't even tell you how many cases that I worked on where kids who had been shot, been stabbed, grew up, wound up stabbing or shooting someone else almost out of fear. So while I was incarcerated, I used the DSM-5 to put together a self-styled test, almost like when you read the magazines back in the day, you check the boxes and add up the scores, right? In a language that the kid understands, to be able to get him to understand the 5 symptoms of PTSD, as well as like how to deal with it, and how arts and music, how different modes of expression can help soothe and bring it down. I'm out here in the country now. That's been my best way to deal with it. But the average kid can't. He might be trapped on the west side of Rockford. I can tell you while I was on pretrial, I stayed right off of Auburn on Vernon Street. There was double and triple murders basically every week. Every 2 weeks, there was someone getting killed right on Auburn. And I was having dreams of people outside my window with guns. And I'd get up to go to court, and the police are parked outside my door before I go to court. So reality reinforces these fears that are buried subconsciously, but that's what we're acting on. That's what these kids are acting on. So you see this hyper violence or hyper aggressive nature, not even understand that most of these kids are just puffer fish. You know, they're just blowing themselves up into this toughness and this tough facade, but they're just kids. They're just teenagers, but the culture and everything is reinforcing this negative identity, and until it becomes a norm in their thinking pattern. So it's very prevalent. You can't live in an area where there's people being shot at 2-3 times a week and not have PTSD. And then the kid isn't even afforded in court a simple instruction to let them know, hey, look, you know, he comes from this area. He may have been engaged in mob action, but he's been beat on 2-3 times prior. He's been injured and put into the hospital prior. So not only do we live it, when we meet the system, there's no mitigation based upon where we come from or what we've been through.
IamKidCulture.org. Patrick Pursley is the founder. He founded this organization while he was in prison. We'll get back to that. I'll put some links here in the show notes about where to find I Am Kid Culture. But also wanted to talk about something that's a hot topic these days. Of course, we're almost 3 weeks away from the presidential election. We're down to Joe Biden or the sitting president, Donald J. Trump. I just have to say there was some candidate forums last week. One of them was a dumpster fire. Both of them were dumpster fires in their own way. One on ABC, one on NBC. They're out there. Watched them. I don't want to get into the weeds on those talks. But the idea of identity politics, of course, Joe Biden said earlier this summer, I believe he talked to a black podcast host or a black newscaster and said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. These types of just ridiculous things that both candidates are saying. Trump is not without his faults. He loves to tweet. He loves to say ridiculous things without vetting the veracity of these things. So we have this idea, though, that black people, white people should vote for particular candidates. Christians and Muslims should vote a certain way. Gay people should vote a certain way. How does that affect things in the midst of civil unrest, where we have the president who's accused of being a racist, but we see Joe Biden has said some very overtly racist things over the years, such as he didn't want his kids to be schooled in a racial jungle, his words, not mine. But then, of course, you have Donald Trump, who stumbles in cases where he's asked to denounce white supremacy. Now, I believe he's done it dozens of times, not as eloquently as I believe he should have said it, because he is a counterpuncher and doesn't like to be challenged. But we have this idea that if you are a certain race, you're a certain religion, you should vote for a certain candidate. How is that playing into permeating throughout the black community? And is there some confusion there? Because, I mean, not all, there are black conservatives, believe me. And what kind of confusion is happening in the streets? Am I the only one who sees it? But we see the Black Lives Matter movement. I believe it's being hijacked by these white anarchists. How is this playing into identity politics from someone who comes from a background like yours?
That's a loaded question. Identity politics. If you're black, you're supposed to vote for a Democrat. If you're white, you got the option Democrat or Republican. I think this is just basically about the lack of choices. So Malcolm X was one of my first heroes, and he said, you have the Democrat, he is like the fox, and you have the Republican, he's like the wolf. They both want to eat you, but they both have different strategies. Now that may be when you say a tad bit hard on the system or hard on both parties, but there's and I personally have I know a black guy who was telling me that red is the new black, and he he made so much money, he's going to vote for Trump. And then I also know plenty of Black people who are lukewarm about voting for Biden. They look at Ms. Harris as just a former prosecutor, right? So they are not energized. I personally think that's one of the greatest ills of our society is the lack of political choices. Me being old, 55, I've been able to watch how we kind of went from left to right to left to right. And so like you get disillusioned with Obama and you swing to Trump, then you swing to Harris, but it went, you know, if you go back in time, if you go back further, right, you get the Bushes and then you get the Clintons, right? And so it goes, it's almost like America swings from left to right, and that's the way it kind of stumbles down the, you know, the timeline, and it rules through disillusionment. So myself, I never really considered myself Democrat or Republican. However, I'm going to vote now, right? I'm energized to vote now. I hope everyone votes now. But I think I just think it's a great disservice to just have a two-party system. So you can know this guy's full of crap and this guy's full of crap, but you're still forced to, you know, pick the lesser of two evils. And it doesn't matter on which side of the coin you're looking at. You know, I hear so many people as far as, you know, really pro-Trump, they say he's made them a lot of money. And then you hear the opposite narrative. And I think it's a great disservice that we're a two-party system, because it really limits choices, and it really seems like it seems like professional wrestling to me. It just really does. It smacks of, you know, just, you know, a control mechanism, and it you know, left and right, just two hands on the same body.
I mean, the idea of professional wrestling, the old circuses where the carnival barker would rally the crowd to see the bearded lady, right? And the crowd knows the beard's fake, but they're still coming back because it's being presented as one of the wonders of the world. Professional wrestling, we all know it's fake, but we continue to tune in. Donald Trump is very much perfect in that role, and he's playing that carnival barker role right now in the White House. But I think that's lent to the very well to the narrative that's coming out of the left, and that's blue no matter who. We'll settle for Biden. He may be a racist, he may be a perverted old uncle, but he's not going to be running anything. And I think they're very clear.
That hurts me because he is one of the orchestrators of what, you know, these laws in the mid 90s that became you know, led to this mass incarceration.
Absolutely.
So how am I to reconcile that?
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Or Harris, who's a former prosecutor. It is you know, there's no nuance to this. There's no choice. There's really no choice. So you're having this record turnout, and you're having the Black vote energized to get Trump out of there, much like you had the white vote energized against Obama, you know? And that goes back to this ruling through disillusion, where we swing left and we get sick of them, then we swing right and we get sick of them, and that's how we go down the timeline. I would really hope that America finds a better way to rule, because this here is you know, cash rules and the golden rule, and that seems to be it.
So do you think we're waiting for, well, I'll just say this. We know what Donald Trump is. We've seen Donald Trump as a television personality for long enough to know he is this carnival barker. He's your P.T. Barnum, your modern day P.T. Barnum. We even before he was a television personality, you get what you get with Donald Trump. Joe Biden seems to be that he's hiding behind this progressive movement that's radicalized, and he's attempting to use some dog whistles there to sort of identify with that plank of the party. When those of us who are old enough to know what Joe Biden is, he's not a progressive whatsoever. You mentioned the 1994 crime bill. Not only did he vote for it, Joe Biden wrote most of that crime bill. So to say that he's suddenly a progressive I would think that any black person would be scratching their head.
But it's all about today. It's not about yesterday.
Right.
Because that's, remember the book 1984, right? When someone falls out of favor, they were forever out of favor. Or when someone was out of favor and it becomes in favor, they were forever in favor. So America, the population doesn't really care. They just kind of focus on the now, and it's, once again, to me, it just goes back to lack of choices and just kind of the fakeness of the whole situation. It's really sad because things for people on the bottom do not seem to change, but for the worse, no matter who's in there.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what do marginalized swaths of the American population need out of a president? Be it Trump, again, he has his faults, or Joe Biden, who I believe won't be running much if he's elected. What does America need to find that sense of community? So we realize that things that are not happening in my backyard are still my problem.
We need genuine leadership with empathy. I think one of the greatest faults that my community finds with Trump is his language game is very divisive, and I personally believe that his rhetoric has got people killed. Just me personally. The left and the right has saw fit to charge everyone up through this like polarization, right? And that is the last thing we need. It's like politicizing a pandemic. So we're fighting about face masks, right? But people are still dying nevertheless. And so we don't seem to pull together as a country until there's an external threat. And that's only for the sake of war and vengeance and all these things. So what we need to find genuine leadership that is empathetic, but also cares about the bottom line, right? Because obviously the economy, right? It's the economy, stupid, right? That's an age-old maxim, right? So we can't think that, we're going to just throw open the prison cells and forgive everyone for their errors, and the economy's going to do great and we'll just pay everyone $25 an hour. Obviously, there's no simple solution to this. But the number one thing, we need a leader who is literally seen, to be an honest person who truly cares about both ends of the spectrum and unites instead of divides. And that's a tall order. That's a tall order.
Now, have we had that leader in the last, I'd say, 50 years? There are some that say that Barack Obama was that leader. He was certainly a wonderful speaker, but there are some people who say he did nothing for certain members of the population. His foreign policy was in question, and of course, there's members of the Black community that say Barack Obama did nothing for us. But again, there are some people who would say George Bush was a great president. So we have all these narratives and all these things. That there are some that praise Trump, and I would say giving Trump a grade on his economy before COVID. I believe he's close to an A there. I believe he's done some things that should be praised, but I think the ridiculous things that he says in social media and during interviews just overshadows all of that. So have we had a leader that has done these things adequately in the last several decades?
I myself, I come from the school of thought that Obama's he was a good president. Very low on the scandal sheet, right? But as a Black person, I can't really say, other than as a fine role model, I can't really point to things, there were, of course, there were some things with the crack versus cocaine and the sentencing structure that were dealt with and are being continue to be dealt with. But I just see divisiveness. I don't think Obama tried to divide. I just don't think that, I don't believe that the majority of white people would allow him to be able to really do anything for the people on the bottom. It's like, oh, I knew it. There he is. That's Barack Hussein, right? You have the dog whistle language, right? So anytime he even moved it a certain way, he would be accused of placating. There was in Stateville, there was a Black woman who became a warden, and she was a fair warden. Well, the officers in the officers union, they took to the streets and called her inmate lover. You see what I'm saying? So there's a way almost like to stop people from even moving on the good within themselves, because they will be considered coddling criminals, right? We all have that language, right? So I don't think we've actually had someone who can withstand the challenge from both sides to be able to unite.
Okay. Patrick Pursley, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to have you back. I'm going to force you to come back.
Honor for me.
Well, thank you. You're an interesting, you're a wealth of knowledge when it comes to just about everything. And it's, your history, your past is certainly an inspiration to me. And I'm sure you're an inspiration to the kids that reach out to you, or the kids that you are reaching out to. I've met some of them, wonderful kids. They're looking up to people like you. Believe me, I can see it. I'm sure you can see it. I'm sure there's joy in that. I'm glad to have known you. But we're going to keep doing this, folks. We're running out of time. But in the meantime, look it up yourself. It's all on the internet. We will see you next week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.